I don't know. How do you think that's my problem?
In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we have been reading the chapter titled The Object of Knowledge and now the Status of Knowledge. In these chapters, Sri Aurobindo is developing the overall approach of a yoga of integral knowledge, distinguishing from the conventional yoga of knowledge, which, as it seeks to realize the divine through knowledge, begins to withdraw gradually from the world. The integral yoga of knowledge, though, does not withdraw from the world, but embraces the world equally in its realization of the divine. This, he explains, is possible because the divine that we seek is the same divine who manifests himself as the world, who, although lost in the most intolerant nirvana, still is here in the world as completely and as thoroughly as he is in his ineffable self extinction. And if the divine is as much in the world as outside, therefore the realization of that divine also gives us as much access and effectivity in the world as he has, at the same time being as free from the limitations of the world as he is. So it is to this direction that the path of integral knowledge takes us. And this, we must see, is one of the three broad foundations of the integral yoga itself. In the larger scheme of the integral yoga, there are three starting points: the path of integral works, the path of integral devotion, and the path of integral knowledge. The three merge to create a practical foundation in life for the higher transformational aspect of the integral yoga. So now in the second chapter, the status of knowledge, Sri Aurobindo now leads us to how we can attain to this knowledge experience of the divine in an integral experience. First of all, he says it is not possible to reach to that purely through an intellectual process, because the knowledge of the intellect is primarily founded on the sense perception, reasoning from the sense perception, and above that, a kind of a speculative construction. All of this can take us far in terms of material application in material life, but it cannot take us to the kind of greater knowledge that we are seeking. to the greater consciousness which we are seeking. This greater consciousness, he says, is not an enlightened or illumined mentality supported by greater dynamic energy or supporting a purer moral life and character. So he puts it clearly outside the range of what popularly passes for spirituality today. When you seek to popularize spirituality, especially if the intention is to create a mass movement, you are required to dilute both the message and the experience so that it can be accessible to the masses. And when that kind of dilution takes place, we find generally spirituality ends up in this narrow band of enlightened or illumined mentality. You have high thoughts, you have ideals. As Mahatma Gandhi once defined spiritual life as simple living and high thinking. So it makes it accessible to the common man. You still do what you do, but you fill it with some idealistic, illumined thoughts, and it stops there. Or supported by greater dynamic energy. So you find suddenly that there's a tremendous power of action. You're able to do so much more. Your life is now more easy to handle. When people meet charismatic leaders of movements, they come away very impressed, overwhelmed by, oh, he's so powerful, he's so engaging, he's so inspiring. We went tired, we came out fresh, we came out inspired, energetic. He does so much, he sleeps only a few hours. We see that dramatic action of an energy, and that is, of course, appears as spirituality. Or he says, supporting a purer moral life and character. This is the other facet of populist spirituality, where you run various orphanages, you give things, you do social service, you open so many hospitals, you have looked after so many people, given them free education, and oh, he's a very spiritual man, or it is a very spiritual movement. But these are not at any point tapping into this greater consciousness that we seek. And for this, it is not merely, he says, a degree of ordinary human consciousness. It is superior in kind and in essence. The change not only on the surface, but in the very foundation, in the dynamic principle. That is, the power which dynamizes here is of a different order. The consciousness in which you live and on which you are founded is of a different grade altogether. And into this, the yogic knowledge seeks to enter. This is already present in our life, but occultly, well hidden behind. We do not access it, we do not know it in the normal spectrum of human activity. And then he says, it is only that consciousness alone that truly knows, and only by its possession can we possess God and rightly know the world and its real nature and secret forces. So the point he makes here is, the world that we know through our senses is an appearance of something else which we do not see in the appearance. It's like saying, you pick up this thing, it looks like a flower, but actually it's not. It is something altogether different, which in appearance is like a flower. Now, if you start with this, you'll wonder, well, what is that other thing that it is? And there is no way you can get to it, because your only means of approaching it are through the senses and through the rational play upon the senses. But when the thing is seen from that greater consciousness. We see the thing itself, that is, which appears to us, to our senses, as the flower. Now, this logic will apply to everything in the world. The world itself is something other than what it appears. But we are limited to what the appearance alone reveals. It is a phenomenal expression of something beyond the mind and the senses. The data of the senses, the knowledge of which the senses and intellectual reasoning from the data of the senses can bring us, is not true knowledge. It is a science of appearances. So all the knowledge you may gain of this flower through the senses and through the application of logic will not be true knowledge, he says. It will only be the science of appearances. And if you look at it this way, almost all of modern science is just this: a description and an organization of appearances. And at the end of it all, finally, nothing is explained. All is described in greater and greater detail, but nothing is explained. Finally, the scientist says, well, that's how it is. And then he says, even the appearances cannot be properly known unless we know first the reality of which they are images. This reality is their self. So having applied our science to the universe, to the flower, and all the descriptions now organized, we still do not know, because we do not know the reality which represents in these images. The practical problem is this: when you approach that deeper reality, because it is supra-rational, it can be articulated in rational terms, but not just one set of rational terms, but many different sets of rational terms. And that is why you find in science this practical difficulty. There are entire categories of theories. There is a whole category of theory we call quantum theory, quantum mechanics, quantum electrodynamics, quantum chromodynamics. So there are all subcategories within. None of them unite with the others. At some point or the other, they are disconnected, unable to reconcile one to the other. But this is one broad category. There is another broad category which has to do with relativity, special relativity, and then general relativity. Again, there are two subcategories which do not see eye to eye. And the whole branch of relativity does not see eye to eye with quantum mechanics, which does not see eye to eye with classical mechanics. And you wonder why. Why is it that it's so hard to describe reality in one theory? Precisely because reality is not rational. If it was rational, you could get it all together in one big rational description. It is not irrational, but it is supra-rational. And therefore, although it has the character of rationality, it is somehow wider, more fluid, more flexible. And so by approaching through rational lenses, we tend to reduce it to something. The moment you have reduced it, you have lost something. A different approach will reduce in a different way, but still lose something. Now you have two pieces of perception of reality. Each sees the reality in its own unique way, but each has lost something, and therefore they can never join. The only way you can get to a complete description of that is if you could describe a supra-rational experience, experience it, convey it supra-rationally, then you would have a complete science which will be whole, indivisible. And of course, there are ways to rationally state them without reductionism, but it would still require eventually that you use the rationality as a ladder to make that last step into experience. And this is what Sri Aurobindo is going to lead us to. Not only he will point out how we get to that experience, he will teach us to develop the tools by which we can experience a supra-rational consciousness and know the world supra-rationally. So he says, unless you know first the reality of which these are images, you cannot even know these properly. So you end up with theories and theories, but at the end of it, nothing is sure. This reality behind is their self, and there is one self of all. When that is seized, all other things can then be known in their truth, and no longer as now only in their appearance. In the approach of modern science, we find something quite radically different from the approach of, let, let me give a name now, Vedic science or spiritual science or whatever term you decide to describe the scientific approach which goes directly to that reality. The difference is, in my exploration, I have found primarily one term in which the difference can be stated. In modern science, we look at form, shape, structure as prior, and properties emerging out of those forms, shapes, and structures. You take any atom, whether it is an atom of oxygen, an atom of iron, an atom of gold, they're all made of the same protons, electrons, neutrons. You rearrange them, suddenly iron becomes gold, gold becomes oxygen, oxygen becomes helium. You can turn anything into anything just by rearranging these. But nowhere do we explain why that arrangement produces such totally different qualities. There is no explanation. We just say, well, this is the structure of oxygen, this is the structure of iron. But why that structure gives the rise to these qualities? Well, that's how it is. It stops there. The spiritual science, and we see this in the way the Vedic scientists articulated it and also developed technologies, it sees qualities first. The underlying reality is Satchidananda. It is divinity, conscious, self-aware, of unending quality, Ananta Guna, infinite potential, pouring out that infinite potential. And as a quality flows, as a quality of pure consciousness, when you reach out to touch it, you of course meet the quality in certain ways, which leads to an appearance, a perception of a certain structure. I see structure is an outcome, is an appearance of a reality which is essentially quality of consciousness, power of consciousness, which reaches out a certain pattern of response, which appears as the structure and pattern of appearances. If you think of it this way, the flower is a bundle of consciousness. As I reach out to touch it, the response, the relationship of that consciousness to my fingertip is the sensation of softness. The response and the reaction of the light touching it is a certain modification of the light frequency, which gives rise in my mind of the sense of this color and this shape and so on. But it is a bundle of consciousness. And so the bundle of consciousness, if you identify with it, you can from within mold it, reshape it, and draw out new qualities, withdraw certain qualities. And so the yogi, and this is the case of Kavyakantha Ganapati Muni, he takes a piece of a coin in his hand, he is chatting with children, and after a while, concentrating on the coin while he is talking to them, he opens his hand and the coin has been transmuted into gold. Now you wonder how such a thing is possible from pure modern science, which looks at structure and form first. You would need a tremendous amount of energy to rearrange those atoms and subatomic particles to create gold. And the human body doesn't have so much energy, even the mind doesn't have so much energy. How could you do it? It's a miracle because the science as it is described cannot explain it. But from the spiritual science perspective, oh, he just withdrew the metallic iron quality and infused into it the gold quality. And that's it. The patterns of the consciousness response rearrange themselves automatically. You didn't have to pick atoms and electrons, protons, and subatomic particles. You just shifted the quality of consciousness from within the substance. It's so simple. It doesn't take much energy. It only takes the power of identification of consciousness to enter into the matter and reshape it from within. If you think of it, this is what we are doing constantly in our psychological world experience. I meet somebody, and at first I'm a little wary. Who is this person? Why is he approaching me? He looks a little angry. And I put out a quality of resistance, tension, hardness, like a shield to protect myself. And then he comes and bursts into a smile and says, "Oh, do you remember me?" And immediately I shift from inside myself, in my state of consciousness, I shift the quality, I soften up, I also smile and I greet him. The transmutation of our consciousness is something that's happening all the time. Because we're identified with it, we can choose to be whatever we choose to be from within. The piece of metal in my hand is not in my range of identified consciousness. Therefore, I am not able to shape it as easily. My body is only partially in identification. So I can will my fingers to move and I don't even think about it. It's nothing special. But I'm not able to will the muscles and the bone to grow as rapidly as I could move my fingers because that part is still subconscious and I'm not able to identify with that layer of consciousness. But if you think in these terms now, the whole understanding and world experience is now completely different. The potential of what is there is so much greater, so much more flexible, free. So he says, the appearances cannot be properly known unless first we know first the reality of which they are images. And this is what the problem of modern science is. It started with the appearances only and is struggling to guess at the reality behind it, but reducing it to the level of only senses and logic. So he says, now this is the paragraph that we last read. It is evident that however much we may analyze the physical and sensible, we cannot by that means arrive at the knowledge of the self, or of ourselves, or of that which we call God. If we confine ourselves to the senses, and from the beginning we say there is no other reality, then of course we end up with the conclusion there is nothing else. So he says it's just a circular logic. We come back to the original assumption. We prove nothing. Now we continue with the next paragraph. If then there is a self, a reality not obvious to the senses, it must be by other means than those of physical science that it is to be sought and known. The intellect is not that means. Undoubtedly, there are a number of supra-sensuous truths at which the intellect is able to arrive in its own manner and which it is able to perceive and state as intellectual conceptions. The very idea of force, for instance, on which science so much insists, is a conception, a truth at which the intellect alone can arrive by going beyond its data. For we do not sense this universal force, but only its results. And the force itself we infer as a necessary cause of their results. So if you look at the story of science, modern science, you will find that this concept of force is there at a very early stage. It stays pretty much the same throughout, all the way till today. Only we tend to categorize more and more kinds of forces. We find different kinds of forces and then we try to reduce them all to one force. Science today believes in 4 distinct forces: gravitational force, electric force, magnetic force, strong force, weak force. It has merged the electromagnetic. It wants to merge the strong and weak. We are at that brink where we have 3 or 4 forces, but somehow we are not able to reduce them further. But if you ask yourself, what is this force? Where did this idea come from? Well, we see the planets move around the sun as if. So obviously the sun is exerting some force on the planets. We see the moon move around the earth. The earth is exerting some force. We step off from the edge of a cliff and we fall down. So earth is somehow exerting some influence on us. And we've used a term called force. What do we mean by that? If you think about it, there is no physical basis for this force. You could be in outer space, you could be in the middle of the ocean, the force is still somehow everywhere. It seems to pass through matter. It passes through everything. It reaches out to you, grabs you, and does something to you. From where does it come? We do not know. How does it move you? We do not know. What it is in between? We do not know. It's just an abstract concept, force. And so in the history of science, there's always this struggle whether force exists as a pure reality or whether it needs a medium to traverse. And one of the strange conclusions we have come to through observation is the gravitational force is not dependent on any medium. It has to act instantaneously. If it did not act instantaneously, if there was a delay, like the light from the sun reaches us after 8 minutes. So when you look at the sun here, it was actually here 8 minutes ago. Now it's already moved much farther. You don't see it. But the gravitation of the sun is instantly hitting you. If it had a delay of 8 minutes or even of 1 minute, then the planets would spiral into the sun. They would not continue in their orbit. Now, this is pure mathematical calculation. Here is something which acts instantaneously. How far? Across the whole universe. Isn't that something quite unimaginable? And here was science telling you all the time nothing can move faster than light, except this one force, which of course you cannot see, whose origin you do not know, which somehow acts across the whole universe instantly. And already what's happening is, as you dwell on this idea of force, you are drawn to something deeper, a reality behind which is a uniting reality, which holds the whole universe together somehow and transcends distance, space, and time even to some extent. So when we look at any principle of science, you go deep enough, eventually you begin to touch something that is one, universal, transcending divisions of space and divisions of time. So here he says how he is pointing out how the intellect can arrive at this conception of force, although it has no basis in pure senses. We see things happening, we conceive of a force. I move a magnet, the metal pieces, iron pieces move. I conceive of a force, though I see nothing, I feel nothing. And the force, he says, is an inference, a cause of these results. So also the intellect, by following a certain line of rigorous analysis, can arrive at the intellectual conception and the intellectual conviction of the self. And this conviction can be very real, very luminous, very potent as the beginning of other and greater things. This line is extremely important for us because it shows you one of the gateways by which we can enter into a relationship with the self and even enter into a realization of the self. Sri Aurobindo describes how when he was 12, I believe, he was reading the certain Indian texts, I think the Upanishads, when he had the experience of the mental experience of the self. And if you have that already, you have an experience of the self, an experience, not the whole experience, but already an experience is great because you have the beginning of something real, even if it is touched only with the mind. And he's describing this here, how it actually that happens. The intellect, by following a certain line of rigorous analysis, can arrive at the intellectual conception and the intellectual conviction of the self. And this conviction can be very real, very luminous, very potent as the beginning of other and greater things. So, just now, as we were discussing the force, and I pushed the scientific logic to its limit, you're already conceiving of something that can act across the extremes of the universe instantly, move things instantly, not only move, but therefore hold them in its grip instantly. What can traverse space and be instantaneously everywhere in the universe, holding everything together? And it's obviously not a material thing. It is one thing, because it's the one thing which is everywhere. And you notice also that when it is holding things together, there is a consistency of how it holds things across time, across space. As it holds things the way that it holds them now, it holds the same way as it did a century ago, a million years ago, and a million years from now. And if you were to follow how it holds and pushes things, it would eventually lead to an arrangement a million years hence, which you can describe right now. It knows exactly how it's going to carry it, push it, move it, keeping it all in consistency. And therefore, we can speak of a universal law of gravitation. Similarly, when you look at numbers, we find again relationships between numbers. 2 plus 2 is 4. 10 divided by 2 is 5. Eternally, universally. Everywhere in the universe, across time, we find the pattern is stable. What is it that holds this relationship of something which is completely non-material? Numbers are not material objects. Something holds them together. It's like a supra-rational consciousness that knows, of which the mathematics is a rational articulation, a way of approaching it. And this is why in the early explorations of mathematics, they saw it almost as a mystical science. In India, you find in the Vedic tradition, the mathematics, the numbers were associated with deities, their arrangements, geometric patterns were associated with powers of consciousness. Similarly, in the Greek schools of wisdom, they looked upon mathematics and numbers with the same awe and reverence as they would to any spiritual pursuit. And it was as if in exploring numbers, you were entering in deeper relation with some kind of a divine mind, divine consciousness, divine knowledge. When we similarly pursue physics into the microscopic, we find that the subatomic particles also behave in strange ways. They are waves, they are particles, their patterns, their responses change according to our expectations, according to how we arrange the experiment. We find particles across great distances interconnected. Moving one instantly switches the other, non-locality as they call it. All of these lead us to a perception that there is something underlying which holds it all together in consistency. And in this way, we are beginning to glimpse the self. It was recently I came across writings of a scientist. I was trying to recall his name. And he uses this word because he has to put all these ideas in rational terms as a scientist, as a physicist. So he uses the term singularity to describe this underlying reality. And he says, if you can tap into that singularity, if you recognize that there is a layer where space and time break down, you are instantaneously everywhere, then that's how you could travel across the universe instantly without ever needing to move. And so that will be the propulsion of the future. So he's talking of all these things, he's giving them a name, singularity. But what is singularity? It is that status where all space and time distinctions collapse into one. And he describes it in these terms: all past, all present, and all possibilities are simultaneously there. Now, this is nothing but the description of the Brahman. Only he has now garbed it in a terminology of science. And he says, so you can take a material object, let's say a spaceship, and by a certain process which we have still to discover, take it back into that singularity, at which point it is everywhere in the universe, and then bring it out in some other galaxy. And there you are. Instantly you have teleported yourself without ever needing to move. It sounds so simple, right? You don't have to go faster than light or struggle with all these weird problems. But this is exactly what the yogi does when he projects his consciousness somewhere else. He withdraws into a state of consciousness where he's transcending the sense of space as we have it, moves perhaps in a subtler space, or even does not move and is simply everywhere and senses, feels, reflects in his consciousness whatever he chooses to know, or acts upon wherever it is he wants to act. So all of these are basically deep spiritual truths and realities now articulated in terms that look like science, a terminology which is scientific sounding. What you have done actually is arrived at a conception of the self. And when we dwell upon it, it's a meditation on the self through the mind. Through the mind and its sensory perceptions. And then when you look around and you gaze at the universe and say, my God, everything is held in this singularity. You are dwelling on the Brahman, on the self. You've just changed the vocabulary. And when you dwell on it in this way, it leads first from the intellectual conviction, from the intellectual conception to an intellectual conviction. And the conviction is an experience. I know it's true. I know it's real. Somewhere inside, at the back of my mind, I can feel its reality. It was from such a conviction that Einstein refused quantum mechanics. And he said, I cannot accept that God will play dice with the universe. Because quantum mechanics essentially is all about chance. That there is no stable reality. All is chance and flows of chance, and patterns simply fall into place when we interact with them by chance. And he said, somehow this doesn't feel right. In relation to what? In relation to a deeper conviction that he already has, in which one already senses things. One senses, if I may use this word, the mind of God. How would God think? How would the divine want to formulate the universe to make it meaningful and an expression of what he is? In a sense, that's what the scientist is meditating upon when he touches this conviction. So first we start with an intellectual conception which leads to an intellectual conviction. We can similarly approach this self from a very sensory, rational approach by looking at all objects and thinking, oh, this is made of proton, electron, neutron. This is made of proton, electron, neutron. Everything is ocean of energy, one energy formulating in these bubbles of particles. And if you meditate on this with your eyes open and look at everything as one massive energy, and all matter is foam of this energy, bubbles formed in this energy, you are meditating on the self. And this leads, and he says, this conviction can be very real, very luminous, very potent, as the beginning of other and greater things. These three words are very suggestive. First, as you have this conviction, it grows more and more real. You're not only thinking about it, you're sensing, feeling, perceiving it. That's the reality which I'm looking at as a scientist now. And then the reality acquires a character of its own. It becomes luminous, it gives off light, it reveals to you insights which earlier you did not have. In fact, this is what happened to many of the scientists, early scientists of quantum mechanics, who were also students of the Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads. Many of them had studied Sanskrit, were reading the original, and all of these ideas crept into the terminology of quantum mechanics and its assumptions. But at some point, it is as if you're touching a reality which is revealing more and more of itself. It becomes luminous and then very potent, because now it leads you to deeper and deeper perceptions, even taking you beyond mind. So can, as the beginning of other and greater things. So the intellectual perception of the self is an excellent starting point for those who are so intellectually oriented to meditate in this way. But a similar approach could be taken from the heart, where you feel the relationship with all things, feel this sense of the divine presence filling all things, of the divine energy filling all things. And so from the heart begin to, we won't use the word conceive, but sense, perceive, and through the senses of the eyes, with the heart filling them, reach a similar kind of relationship and perception and conviction and experience. So this being the case, we recognize the validity, the value of the intellect's approach. Still, in itself, intellectual analysis can only lead to an arrangement of clear conceptions, perhaps to a right arrangement of true conceptions. But this is not the knowledge aimed at by yoga. So we can get somewhere, even a clear arrangement of the conceptions. We want to get to something which is even beyond, supra-rational. For it is not in itself an effective knowledge. A man may be perfect in it and yet be precisely what he was before, except in the mere fact of the greater intellectual illumination. The change of our being at which yoga aims may not at all take place. And we only have to look at the story of many of these scientists. Even though they had these almost mystic perceptions of an underlying reality and self, their personal lives were often a big mess. Many of the great artists had extraordinary perceptions of underlying layers of reality, even glimpses of the divine reality behind, which reflected in their art or their music, but their personal lives were often a mess. So there's something to be said about the limitation of this greater intellectual illumination, but we want something which will change us fundamentally in the process of realizing it. So before we get to that, how we will enter that kind of a experience, we have to see how our current way of thinking is coming in the way of getting to that. This is such a big problem because we are used to thinking, we are used to knowing the world, we created a construction of what the world is like for so many decades of our life. And we become trapped by our own conceptions. This is not possible. There's a very interesting examples. I once watched a mentalist by the name of George Senehi. He has this ability of bending spoons with his mind and doing other things. He moves objects from a distance. So I once watched him playing with a child. He dropped a pencil on the ground, and then from a distance he moved his hand and the pencil moved. First the child was amused, then he was surprised, and then he looked at this man with a stare of horror and then began to cry and went away. What did you just do? You broke my pretty perception of reality. The other experiments which also show us what's happening inside, very deep inside, with babies unable to speak at the age of 6 months, They are shown pictures or shown arrangements of objects. And then they are shown an arrangement of object which would normally be impossible by conventional laws. So for example, they're shown a pile of bricks put in a certain way, no response. And then they're shown one brick hanging in midair. Of course, it's done by a stick supporting from behind, which the baby cannot see from his angle. The child stares at that brick. He ignores all other bricks. He stares at that brick and then begins to cry, or he is afraid. Now, of course, the experiment was to show that even at that very early age, before we have organized our sense of reality, there is some underlying sense of what is normal and what is not normal. And when we are faced with this abnormality of reality, we feel uncomfortable. And I'm taking this example to show how deep it goes. It's there almost from your birth. It's part of the physical mind, part of the inheritance of our human mental consciousness in its evolution. But when you now take it to higher and higher stages, let's say when we go to a magic show, we see something performed, it bothers us. Of course, we enjoy that sense of bother. It's fun, it's a surprise, but it bothers us. And eventually, you will notice people justify it to themselves by some weird description, weird explanation, which will not hold even to their own logic. But only when they have justified it to themselves, then they stop thinking about it. Until then, it will continue to bother you. Oh, he must have hidden it in his sleeve. Now I'm happy. I've explained it away. But then if I tell you, but he didn't have sleeves, there must be something else which was hidden. He shot it in his hand from some hidden device. There was someone behind the stage who threw it in his hand. I just didn't see it being thrown. You're always explaining away any aberration of reality. And it's such a deep habit, we are not comfortable unless we are able to cover up, to make things back to what we call normal. And this comes in the way of a deeper perception, a deeper experience. This is what Sri Aurobindo deals with in the next paragraph. It is true that intellectual deliberation and right discrimination are an important part of the yoga of knowledge. But their object is rather to remove a difficulty than to arrive at the final and positive result of this path. Our ordinary intellectual notions are a stumbling block in the way of knowledge, for they are governed by the error of the senses, and they found themselves on the notion that matter and body are the reality, that life and force are the reality, that passion and emotion, thought and sense are the reality. And with these things, we identify ourselves. And because we identify ourselves with these things, we cannot get back to the real self. So, first, intellectual deliberation and right discrimination are an important part of the yoga of knowledge. So, we are not going to discard this deliberation and discrimination of the intellect. They are tools. In fact, in other places in the same synthesis of yoga, he highlights the importance of this discriminating power of the intellect to cut through self-deception, to cut through what would be otherwise very simple errors of the mind or the senses. But with that, we know that the goal of these tools is to remove difficulties and not to arrive at the result, at the final result of the path. So the ordinary intellectual notions are a stumbling block in the way of knowledge. And these ordinary notions, he gives broad categories of those notions. We could elaborate each of those categories. But broadly, what is common to all of them is they are governed by the error of the senses, and they found themselves on the notion of the body, life, passion, thought as reality. So our first error is to think that what we are seeing, feeling, and experiencing in ourselves is the reality. And we have to now correct this by recognizing that there is a reality of which this is phenomenon. If you try to think of it like that, it feels strange, it feels weird. You mean I'm not me? You mean all that I'm thinking, all that I'm feeling, all that I'm doing is not the reality? It's a phenomenon. What does that mean? It's like a surface wave of an ocean, but what ocean? Where is the ocean? I don't feel it. So if you start uh, thinking with this idea, first thing it does is it destabilizes you. You don't have a base. You don't have something on which you can stand. You are suddenly told that the thing on which you are standing is unreal. You are firmly established in thin air. So what do you do? So all these ordinary intellectual notions are governed by errors of the senses. But the foundation of those errors are matter and body are the reality. This is what we are seeing. When a child sees something which is non-material, parents say, oh, that's your imagination. Now, if you said, oh, that's your imagination, the child will be thinking that, oh, my imagination is something great, it is wonderful. Oh, that's your imagination. Stop bothering me. So, my imagination is something inferior. I have to throw it aside, I have to ignore it. I think some of you would have known, have heard similar stories, but I may even mention the name here now without violating any trust, because she has spoken of this to others also. As a child, Vasantiji used to experience, she would see and play with Sri Krishna physically. So she would go out in the garden, she would see Sri Krishna, she would go and play with him, and then she would come back. Her mother would ask, what did you do in the garden? Oh, I played with Sri Krishna. Oh, very nice, the mother said, and moved on. Oh, yeah, they're children. They have a very vivid imagination. At least she didn't dissuade it. She thought it was a healthy thing, healthy imagination, but still it was imagination. But the thing is, it was not imagination, it was very real to her, because she would play with hours at a time sometimes, and there was a long stretch of grass on which they would play. And then one day he appeared to her and said that this is the last time that I will play with you. You will meet me later in the physical form after a few years. And as it happened a few years later, she came to Pondicherry and she had darshan of Sri Aurobindo and recognized him. So now the experience itself was very vividly sensory to her. But when narrated to an adult, because it does not fit in our conventional reality experience, oh, it is imagination, not belonging to reality. And what is reality? This body matter world. The second error and foundation is life and force are the reality. So it's already a level above, but still life and force as they belong to the material domain. So if you speak of living beings which are non-material, that's not very comfortable. So especially if a being appears which is semi-materialized or in a subtle body form, even if you see it semi-transparent, we are afraid because it does not fit in our normal domain of reality. We don't say, oh, hi, how are you? And walk on as we would to a materialized body. But if the same materialized body dematerializes itself the next moment, and we have stories like that, you meet somebody, you go on, you turn back, the person is gone, you don't see him, or something abnormal, uncomfortable. But still, as long as we experience it as life, forces, energy is moving, yes, that's still part of our reality. Passion and emotion, thought and sense are the reality. And with these things, we identify ourselves. Now, both of these cases, He is discussing our subjective experience and the way we identify in ourselves, but then by extension, we identify with those things as real outside. Here's a very deep truth. When we experience something within us, then we can perceive it outside us and accept it as real. If we have not experienced it within us and we see it outside us, we will not accept it as real. So when children often they ask this question to the embarrassment of their teachers, why do people get married? Okay, and we had that in our class, and one of the teachers said, "Oh, you will understand when you grow up." Oh, it's such a weird thing. Why do they get into all these weird relationships? And you see in movies that they're willing to give up a greater cause just because their beloved is now trapped and held hostage by the bad guys, and they're willing to give up everything. What kind of a strange attachment is this? So, for the child, that kind of an attachment or an emotional compulsion is unreal until he experiences it. Then he sees the same movie and he says, "Oh, yeah, I know that feeling. I would probably end up with the same type of conflict." So we are always transferring our subjective experiences as real, or we are recognizing as real outside us that which we have experienced within us. And this is true of spiritual things equally. When we experience the touch of a deeper vibration in us, then we begin to recognize that vibration outside us. When we have felt the presence of the divine consciousness in its any number of its aspects, powers, then we begin to recognize those in others, in other people's experiences. When we are aware of layers inside us, subtle physical, subliminal layers, or even higher grades of consciousness above the intellect, those we now recognize in others, or that influence in a certain situation. And that's why it's so critical that we begin our quest of the perception, knowledge, experience of these higher things internally, subjectively first. He will come to that description, that discussion later. But then the problem right now is because we have identified ourselves with these superficial parts of ourselves, we cannot get back to the real self. Therefore, it is necessary for the seeker of knowledge to remove this stumbling block and to get right notions about himself and the world. For how shall we pursue by knowledge the real self if we have no notion of what it is and are on the contrary burdened with ideas quite opposite to the truth? And this is where the study of these texts becomes so important, because it actually rearranges our worldview. I remember when I was small in kindergarten, my mother would say that, "Oh, I'm going for meditations." After a while hearing that word many times, I asked her, "What is this meditation?" So she said something like, "Oh, we sit down and we go inside." So I thought about it for a few days or weeks, and finally I asked her, "But how do you get inside? How do you pull your arms inside? How do you put your head and legs inside?" And then one day she brought me here and I saw people meditating, and I said, "Oh, okay, so you don't have to take your arms into yourself." Okay, then it's fine. But the starting point was, I am body. When I am body and you go inside, how do you go inside? Well, you have to take your body inside, like a tortoise takes its hands and feet and head into its shell. So if you're starting with an identification of the body consciousness, then a whole lot of things are impossible. Going inside, for example, drawing on an inner source of strength, because that doesn't exist. You have only the biology. Unless you have adrenaline release into your blood, you don't have a burst of energy. So the only way to get energy is to eat more food, to have a state of excitement, agitation, etc. So the whole worldview suddenly becomes so warped that access to higher possibilities is completely cut off. Automatically, instinctively, we begin to move in directions which are the very opposite that we should be doing. I've watched some of these shows where people are made to compete with each other and do challenges, reality shows as they call them. And I found in most cases, even before a person started the activity, I could make out whether he is going to do it or not. There was one exercise, they had to pick up some very small things and pile them up in a precarious pile. It required patience, attention, skill, gentleness, sensitivity. And the person who came, he had to do it, of course, in 30 seconds. He came and he stood before the audience and went, So all the excitement that he was drawing out and drawing accolades from the audience, Aman knew you cannot do something like this. He has pulled himself in a state of agitation and imbalance when the work requires perfect stability and balance. Somebody else came, was very quiet, he was being spoken to, he did nothing, he had no response. You knew he would do it because he was already aligned in himself and the activity would be a reflection of his internal state. Now, these are such simple things to somebody who has been exposed to these ideas. It's one of the most basic things which we learn in the spiritual, in the yogic tradition is that within you is all the potential. That everything you need can be drawn out from inside you. Within you is the peace, within you is the joy and the love and the fulfillment that you seek in life. It's something so fundamental. And out there, there's something like 90% of humanity for whom these are new ideas, alien ideas. And all their life, they have been only reaching out to grab, to reach out and to fail in their dissatisfaction all through. And these are stumbling blocks, obviously. To get the right notions about himself and the world, it's necessary for the seeker of knowledge to remove the stumbling block and to get the right notions about himself and the world. For how shall we pursue by knowledge the real self if we have no notion of what it is and are on the contrary burdened with ideas quite opposite to the truth? So it's the same thing when we seek to realize the self. Unless we have a conception of the self, even if it's a mental conception, even if it's a sensory conception, you need something to begin. Otherwise, you keep saying, oh, you must realize self. Oh, what is self? Oh, it's something which is none of these things. Okay, so what is none of these things? And you're stuck. But if you say it is something which includes all of these things and yet stands behind supporting them, aha, now I can see it, visualize it. If you give an analogy, it is like the backdrop of the canvas on which the painting is formed. And this universe is the painting, it is the canvas of this universe. Aha, I have an analogy. And immediately the mind can begin to conceive of something like an underlying substratum fabric supporting this whole play. It is still an abstract intellectual conception. I don't see it right here. But at least it's a starting point. So you will find Sri Aurobindo refers to a passage of his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, titled The Vision of the Brahman. And it's a 3 or 4 paragraph description. And he recommends this text as a theme for meditation in one of his letters. So you could even take an aspect of it or the whole of it, but still, the point is one can articulate in sensory, rational terms what is the self, although the articulation is not the experience, but still it can be the beginning of a conception leading to a conviction, leading to an experience. Therefore, right thought is a necessary preliminary, and once the habit of right thought is established, free from sense error and desire and old association and intellectual prejudgment, the understanding becomes purified and offers no serious obstacle to the farther process of knowledge. It's still there as an obstacle. The understanding is still an obstacle, but not a serious obstacle. So what is it that has to be done? Right thought is a necessary preliminary. And once the habit of right thought is established, then the understanding becomes purified. So right thought is still not enough. It must become a habit. It must become constant. It must become the normal way of thinking. So again, one would, there's so many things which need to be recast. Even the idea that your thoughts are yours to choose. You are not your thoughts is such a powerful, uh, freeing idea for young people. People struggle with controlling their thoughts. They find themselves trapped by their thoughts, unable to control, change them. And if you're told that thoughts are not you, they're like objects that enter your mind that you can throw out. You can create new ones. You can stand back and observe your thoughts. It's such a great, freeing idea. But then that must become a habit. Whenever I have a thought, a part of me is now watching and filtering. These thoughts I don't like. These thoughts are not helpful to me. These thoughts dull my consciousness. Those thoughts raise me, elevate me, and I can begin to choose. And in this way, there's a purification that's taking place all through. So, a right thought is a necessary preliminary, and the scope of this right thought is very wide. There's so many things which we would look at, which we could use as starting points. So Sri Aurobindo does not specify too much here, because actually one could begin almost anywhere on any facet. In practice, therefore, in the integral yoga, one looks at the person. What is the proclivity of his temperament, the swabhava, the turn of his nature? What is it that predominates in his nature? What is it that's positive and what is it that is negative or weak? And then one picks the positive strength and turns it in a certain way that it now overcomes the weakness and limitation, using that as a first key to start purifying the mind. And then bit by bit, everything else can follow. The texts, introductory texts, such as Basis of Yoga, Lights on Yoga, are again a very good foundation for recasting your worldview. But then there are limitations which persist even when we try to bring in a habit, and these are sense error, desire, old association, and intellectual prejudgment. So when you start culturing your mind, purifying it, still the senses can give you an error. Talking to somebody, I misheard the word he spoke. I wrongly saw, I wrongly read. And sometimes that leads to a whole chain of wrong understanding or wrong conclusion. Desire. I prefer this, I'm attached to this, I desire this outcome, and so my mind is fixed in a certain direction. Even if you tell me, and this is one of those fundamental life-changing ideas, that I as a part of the divine, I as an expression of the divine knows best what's best for me. And therefore, if I put myself consciously in his trust, he will ensure that I am given only what is most useful for me in my life. As an idea, this is so liberating, so powerful. Suddenly, the burden of your life stream events is gone. And I put myself in trust. And then, whatever comes my way, I refer to him, ask for his guidance, and accept that this is perhaps what's useful for me. When it's no more useful, it'll be taken away or it'll be overcome. And so it's not really my problem. And I can trust that only what is really useful for me is given. This I can understand, but the moment I try to apply it, all my old habits of desires start coming. But I like this, I want that, this is more comfortable, this I'm used to, that's too new, I'm scared of what's new. What will happen with the uncertainty? So the sense error, desire, then old associations. Something comes and there's a whole cluster of associations which come with it, which have actually nothing to do with it. They just happen to be a part of an event of my life experience. Even when a spiritual experience is dawning on us, these things can come in as a mixture. For example, very deep rooted within us is an old association of fear with dissolution. That when my consciousness, by the form, the narrow front of my consciousness begins to thin out, to dissolve, to fade or lose its narrowness, there is fear of death, of loss, of various other things. The association comes in, blocks the further unfolding experience. And then intellectual prejudgment. This is a problem which is much more complex, because sometimes our reading comes in the way. An experience as it is unfolding, I start to think, is that the psychic? Is that the vital? Is that my emotional? Oh, this is just my sentimental being. I should ignore it. I should not give it too much importance. And all these ideas may come, they block. And of course, I'm giving one example. Each of these has a whole spectrum of examples which we would ideally want to cover. But as we get free from these four kinds of error, the understanding becomes purified and offers no serious obstacle to the further process of knowledge. Still, a right thought only becomes effective when in the purified understanding it is followed by other operations. And now you see what it has to lead to. By vision, by experience, by realization. These are steps. So first you have right thought, leading to purified understanding, and that leads to vision. You begin now to see, because the thing itself is known directly. As you see, the experience grows, and you have the experience does not last, but as the experience grows in frequency, in depth, it stabilizes, eventually in a realization. So what are these operations? So the other operations which have to follow, that becomes now the theme of the next paragraph. And he says there that these operations are not only psychological self-analysis and self-observation, and these are all useful, but there is something more to which one has to move, and the consciousness has to turn inwards to be able to have these perceptions. And he speaks of the inner vision, drishti. And of course, we will see the inner vision is not like the seeing. I saw a form, I saw it. Inner vision, I saw a flame. It is a seeing in which the perception of an experience of a consciousness, of a reality, simply unfolds. So all of this is now the means, the tools by which we can grow into the deeper knowledge experience. And that will be the rest of the chapter. I think we will pause here. You can take up any questions or any comments. In the early years of the ashram, the mother tried very hard to bring up children with this right values and right thought. She saw in the coming of these children and families an opportunity that she could raise children from the beginning with a completely different worldview. And I have had occasion to interact with people in the ashram who came here already formed or having already passed through some deeper sadhana before they joined the ashram, and the people who grew up here as children, and to observe the difference of mindset and values between these two. And it is quite interesting to see there was a great potential there that the mother tried to tap. One of the experiences which somebody who grew up as a child in the ashram told us was that as children they never felt the need to go to doctors. They rarely fell ill. They didn't need to eat too much. They always seemed to be able to draw spontaneously on a greater energy. And she said how they would just drink this soup and that was it. And then later somebody came from outside with a formal knowledge of medicine and nutrition and health. And he said, this food is not nutritious enough. Children need proper nutrition. And so that doubt was now sown. And the mother, of course, allowed whatever they thought their ideas were of nutrition to be exercised. But she said, till then, none of us knew anything like this. Similarly, we heard from some of the old sadhaks how in the beginning there was no formal medical apparatus. There was the dispensary, and the most common medicine was red medicine. Whatever you had, you were given red medicine. So you had an injury, they applied a red medicine. Had a illness, they gave you some standard dose of some medicine. And that was it. And then one day somebody made a comment that this is not proper medicine and this will not help, it will cause problems. And then Sri Aurobindo instructed them, okay, now you start giving regular medicines because the faith is broken. But if you think of it in these terms, these are all values that we have programmed ourselves into. And there's a huge programming machinery out there which is drilling it into children, into adults, through advertisements and other educational means, which is not always the best. But, well, that's how it is right now. We have to undo so much of it.
Relation between soul and spirit.
Yes. When we speak of, the question is about relation between soul and spirit. When we speak of the soul, we mean an individual center. When we speak of spirit, we mean something which is universal. In essence, they are the same. Spirit individualized is soul. You could see it that way also. The thing is, you look at it this way. Soul is individualization of spirit. Spirit is universalization of soul. But yes, essentially they are the same. But of course, this term soul we are using in the sense of the spiritual center. But we have also a more loose utilization of this word in popular vocabulary. When we say, oh, so and so is a good soul, soulful music, these represent sentimental emotional center and not the spiritual center. So Sri Aurobindo defines the word soul in three degrees. Yes, but first there is the soul, which is the surface desire soul. I, the person I think I am, which is defined by my desires. So if I ask you to explain to me, describe to me a person, what kind of a person is that? So you will give me a description of the person's likes and dislikes. He likes to do this, he does not like that. It's the bundle of habits of likes and dislikes. That's what we call desire soul. That's not the real person. Behind that is something more intimate, which I feel myself to be. But that is the inner soul in Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary. And then there is behind that, unknown to me, the inmost soul, which we call the psychic being. So, soul as a term has an outer desire soul, inner soul, and an inmost soul or true soul. That's the psychic being. That you can say is the true person. Yes, yes. But still, what we mean by soul is the center of the personality, the person that feels himself to be I. If you see this vocabulary, there are three souls that you have. The outer desire soul, which is not true, the inner soul, which is a reflection of the true soul, and then the true soul within, which is journeying across lives. That is only one. Yes. How do you get over these intellectual prejudgments and old associations and desires? By a process, at first, by a process of consciously making your mind free and flexible. Let me first give you some very practical starting points, which I personally found helpful. You know, in Alice in Wonderland, there is an incident where I think the rabbit says that I think one impossible thing every morning before breakfast. Do you remember that incident? There's a description like that. I've always found that to be an interesting idea. Can you make your mind flexible by thinking an impossible thing? Try it as an exercise before breakfast or after breakfast. But as an exercise, when you start thinking in terms of things which normally are outside the purview of your habitual rounds, already it stretches the mind's limits. So, for me personally, one of the most helpful for this was to read science fiction. And there were authors who were more far out in their imagination. But each time reading those authors, one found the mind being pushed to limits. All of these are things are possible. They're just not part of our normal domain of reality experience. And I found very quickly that it was possible to stretch the mind even further on your own. So this is a very simple exercise that I would even recommend for children to be taken through. But the process in us, when if you don't do such exercises, is more complex. It means you start by observing how every time a certain idea comes, there is a whole chain of associations and preconceptions. You're going to meet a person and you are told something. This person is coming from X location, X family, X function. He's a politician. Immediately you have a cluster of associations. Politician, okay, that's what it is like. And you go with the preconceived association, right? To become just to observe and to become conscious that oh, you pulled all these preconceptions even before meeting the person. You hear a name of a person, and the name pulls associations associated with people you know of that name. Then when you meet the person, it's completely different, right? So when you start just observing these things happening in your mind, you can consciously begin to refuse, to reject, and break the associations. The first step to any of this kind of training will be observe what's happening in your own thoughts. And now you have already keywords. So observe the sense errors, pay attention with your senses, observe how your desires come in, observe how your prejudgments intellectually. And often in life you will miss something happens which forces you to realize, oh, you made a mistake. And then you review what kind of mistake was it. Observe where it happened, at what stage it happened, and then put a will next time to be careful. In this way, by a process of self observation, you will become aware. With awareness, you will gain the power now to change and free up. There is another way, which is less strenuous. But if you have done this, then the second way becomes more complete. And that is to open your mind, and it's a process by which you open your mind into a kind of a universal expanse and allow the barriers which limit your mind, which narrow it, to dissolve. And actually allow your mind to lapse back into a kind of a free, flat universalization. It's much more difficult to do unless we have already acquired some control over the mental consciousness. But if you can do this, then it can free up the mind to a great extent. A third way which you could suggest, which you could also apply without exercising the mind directly, both of these involved exercising the mind, is to stand back from the mind, stand back from the emotions, in a status of a free observer, and establish there an equality. So then, whatever comes, even if it has a chain of reactions from the past habits, in the part where you are equal, that chain will not affect so much. And as the equality spreads into the mental consciousness, into the emotional consciousness, eventually, even in the body, in the nerves first, and in the body reactions, you will find all of these tendencies will begin to fade out. So, in the specific practice of the integral yoga, this purification of the mind is done by first establishing an equality, deep base, and then extending that equality in all the parts of the being, and then bringing into it an influence of either the psychic vibration or a higher intuitive light, which then completes the dissolving of these wrong formations. It completes the purification. All of us have vision, experience, and realization. They may happen in very simple things. Somebody is describing to you something new. And as the person describes, in your mind, you're constructing an image, trying to understand what he's talking about. And then suddenly it's as if you break through the image and you glimpse what he's experiencing. And that's your first vision. Right? And then gradually, if you dwell on it, you begin to experience in yourself what he is experiencing, not just seeing it in him. You experience it in yourself. It's happening all the time when we are having conversations and we are trying to convey something which is out of the ordinary. Only the difference is in the yogic space, we use these terms to describe realities which belong to the supra-rational region. But it's the same principle which is happening even in the domain of the intellect or the emotion or even physical sensation. Right. Yes.
number of meaning
Yes.
much more important than anything in the offline. And that's also really
Yes. Yes. Unfortunately, it's yes. For those who didn't hear at the back, the question was when you're working with a large group, you know very well where the discussion will go to, and you're trying to manifest something new, bring something new. It's much easier to do with a group of 5 or 6 than with a large group of 50 or 60. And unfortunately, this is the result of this wide range gradations of human consciousness being mixed together. If we had a group of people who are already sufficiently conscious, who already share in this higher ideal, or who already have some glimpse of the thing which is to be done, then the work can become so much simpler. The advice that the mother gave, that in any kind of this kind of group interaction for manifesting something new, is that before we start, we all concentrate to rise to our highest possible at that moment, and then only engage in interaction. And this was the reason why, even in the physical activities, there's the routine of doing a half a minute of concentration. Of course, people have forgotten what it's like. It's just a way of calming yourself and centering. But if we can all together make the effort to rise to our current highest, whatever that is, and if we start with this assumption that what we have to manifest is already here, it knows what it wants, and we have only to align as best as we can to this thing which we perceive, then all of us, with our differences, can become complementary. When we have not risen to that higher uniting point, then all of us, without our differences, become contradictory. And that's generally the mess that we fall into. But even for this to be done, we must share in this value, that we must make that effort to rise to our highest and work together. So I would think that what is necessary in a large collective interaction like this is to identify people who share this value and start working with them, and then let that group slowly expand to larger. And then the new ones who join in may not be fully in it, but will get pulled up by the group energy now, which is strengthened. In the context of a space like Auroville, the mother said things would be much easier when you have more people, because people of similar type could gather together and work together more easily than now, where you have necessarily to mix people who don't always share in the same values or insights. It will allow also for larger separate groups to work independently. And she said the pressures which you have now would be much less when the number grows to something like 20,000, I think she referred to. Yes. Otherwise, sadly, we tend to fall back to a more individualistic effort, which misses the point of the collective effort. Still, the benefit we have in a space like this is, at the very least, we have certain common values and ideas, which you will not even find elsewhere outside. There, even to speak of manifesting something new, what are you talking about? It's something meaningless. And here you can speak of that at least. But I think a lot of the difficulties, on the one hand, are because people have come in who not necessarily shared in the higher ideals. On the other hand, not enough people who share the ideals. So perhaps when there is a larger influx, then these things will be less difficult. Mhm. So the observation is that light has a shadow, but sound doesn't have a shadow equivalent. It depends how you see it. In the sensory experience, you don't see something obvious like that. But if you understand what's happening behind, then you will see there is an equivalence. So what is shadow? Or what is light first? If you see light as a wave, an agitation, an activity in an underlying medium, when that activity dies down, you have what you call darkness. Sound similarly is a movement in a medium. When the movement dies down in the medium, you have silence. And so silence would be the equivalent of darkness. Right? Huh. Yes. So again, if there was a bright light outside, the glow of the light would still come in, right? So we have something which is called noise cancellation. You can put an anti-sound to another sound. The waves are exactly the opposite, and the two joining, they cancel each other out and there's silence. So you can create an artificial silence by putting out an anti-sound wave. So we have headphones which do that. Perhaps later I will show you. You put on the headphones, it has several mics which listen to the ambient sound, which creeps in anyway, normally, okay, through the gaps. But it creates inside the headphone the exact opposite sound vibration. And suddenly you switch on silence. And there's absolute silence. You don't hear anything. Yes, interesting. You can buy them online. No, but normally these are used in aeroplanes to eliminate the engine noise. When you switch it on, the engine noise is completely gone, but it specifically tunes into the band which is noise. So it does not block speech. Someone speaks to you, you hear them more clearly because the noise is now gone. But you could, in principle, take it all the way and knock out all sounds and you'd have complete silence. What? But you said leaders? Ah, okay. I don't think so. I don't think so. I won't say falsehood is the leader. I will say falsehood has captured centers of power. But the leader is still the truth because eventually the falsehood always breaks. Because it does not have internal consistency and permanence of its own. It's a distortion. A distortion will always eventually fall apart. Okay? But yes, the point you're raising, of course, is that falsehood has a greater sway, it has a greater influence in the world as it is now. But you know what we mean by falsehood also is a very strange thing. It's an abstract idea. Each person in that center of power actually is trying to do something genuine. Maybe what he's doing genuine is for his own interest. I'm genuinely trying to make myself more rich at the expense of others. I just don't notice that it's at the expense of others. And so from a different perspective, it looks like I'm committing a great crime, right? But to myself, I'm just making more money. So all these people in Wall Street who were literally gambling away the savings of a large population, they were simply meeting their targets. Their boss said, you have to sell so much, you have to complete this target, and then you'll get a pay raise. They just did their job. Nobody was conscious that what they were doing was a perversion. Each one within their little bubble was doing what was right. I was earning money for my family, right? So this concept that falsehood has seized on the world is something which is very abstract. You can't pin it down easily. The same thing seen from a certain perspective seems right, from another perspective seems wrong. It becomes clearer when you widen your vision from individual interests to collective interests. Is this thing helping the larger collective good? Is this thing helping the larger evolution? Then you find things which are opposing evolution, things which are harming the collective growth and awakening, and things which are assisting. There we can now speak now. That's why I will not use the word falsehood anymore. Because that is still something more profound, more pernicious. The mother spoke of this in a different way. She said she found the earth's environment suffocating. The falsehood in the world she found suffocating. And that is something else. It's a vibration. It's a vibration of something which denies the divine. And when you feel that vibration, you just feel something is wrong, something is out of place, it's unreal, it's a distortion, a perversion. And that is something much more difficult to deal with on an individual level. But if you look at this question of an action in the context of the larger evolutionary growth, is it helping human evolution or is it delaying? Then it's easy to pin down what's good, what's not. And we can start making a difference already at that level in our individual lives, each one of us, and then in our collective space where we have that occasion. The other thing, though, is more difficult, and it will happen when more and more of us awaken to the reality of the living presence and feel ourselves more and more a part of that larger divine consciousness. Then only that vibration of falsehood will fade away. So next time we will continue with this text where Sri Aurobindo will describe how we prepare ourselves to now have that direct vision of the self and of the divine knowledge. Which text we will take up in the Friday after next. As next Friday we will show a video instead of one of the earlier sessions, as I'll have to be out of station on Friday. But subsequently, at least for a few Fridays, I should not have any further disruptions. And Sunday also we are resuming the study of the Kena Upanishad, except for this Sunday, where we will show a video instead, but we will continue the text on the Sunday after. So just to recapitulate for today, right thought only becomes effective when in the purified understanding it is followed by other operations, by vision, by experience, by realization. Oh.